Welcome back to Crafted in Florida. Today we're going to go over the 5 rules for beginning woodworkers. If you follow these rules, you'll make a lot less mistakes and have a lot more success in your project. Stick around to the end. I'm going to share 2 of my favorite jigs that I like to use when I'm doing woodworking. Check it out. Alright, first rule we're going to go over is measure twice, cut once. Now if you have a dad or a grandpa that ever taught you anything about woodworking or carpentry in general, you've probably heard this before. But it's a very good rule because oftentimes people make that mistake. They pull the tape measure, they think they have the measurement, whether the tape measure is crooked or they just read it wrong. It happens. You end up cutting the piece too short, which is the worst, and now that piece is useless. So it's really important that you have your measurements. When you're pulling your tape measure, make sure that you are pulling it straight across the piece and not at an angle, because obviously an angle is going to be a longer line. Hook that thing on the end, bring it to the desired piece, make your mark. When you make your mark, be as straight as you can, and some people like to do a second mark just to make sure that you know on that point is where you want to line everything up. It's very important that your tape is straight, you're reading everything correctly. Understand the tape measure has play. That is to take into account the thickness of the hook, right? It's supposed to have a little bit of play, but that's going to wear down over time. Too many times pulling it, dropping it back like that, you really should try to catch it and slowly put it back, but we're all human. That's a lot more fun to do, right? So, when you hook your piece, take it all the way down to the end, double check that you have that mark, that you exactly where you want it, and then when you take it over to the saw, make sure your blade's lined up in the right spot. I like to try to take the line, so I'm taking it right there, but there's times where you want to, your measurement is a little bit more than, let's say, a 16th, and you need to just leave the line, okay? Either way, make sure your blade gets lined up correctly, cut that piece, double check your measurements so you're not making extra cuts. That's lesson 1. Rule number 2, have a plan. You need to have some sort of an idea on what you're going to do before you start making a whole bunch of cuts. Now, I like to have things sketched out. I keep a lot of stuff in my head. I like to write it down, kind of draw it up on a piece of scrap paper. Some people do like the SketchUp or some of the other computer programs where they can model the whole thing out. And that stuff's pretty nice. I eventually want to get into that, but that's just not who I am right now. But I do at least have it penciled out. I have the idea in my head. I know how things are going to be put together so that I can make sure it's a solid piece. That doesn't mean you can't adjust things on the fly. And sometimes you're going to find out whether you can, model it out on the computer or not. You're going to have to make a few adjustments here or there. So it is helpful to have that plan, be able to adjust, and then you'll be able to have a lot more success in your project. If you just say, oh, I'm going to build a cabinet and just start putting box pieces together, you're going to end up realizing that you don't take into account some of the other pieces, that adds into the thickness, and what was supposed to be a 24-inch cabinet turns into a 26-inch cabinet because you didn't account for a lot of different things. So have a plan, go through it, account for all the pieces, thickness of pieces, and how it's all going to go together. It's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headaches if you know what you're doing ahead of time. Rule number 3, try new things. This right here is an epoxy table. It's about half done. I'm making it for a local business. I'm going to add their logo to the middle and then put a nice clear coat on top of that. But I hadn't done this 3 weeks ago. Never even thought about making a complete epoxy table, but another customer needed a countertop, wanted to go a little bit cheaper than your typical stone, but didn't want wood. And so I looked up a lot of stuff. Epoxy came up. I did one for them and it turned out great. Now that required a ton of research and a lot of YouTube videos online learning, how do I do this? How do I put this together? What's the best way to pour the epoxy? A lot of stuff goes into it before you just throw yourself out there. But trying new things is what makes you better. If you don't ever do anything different, if you're only building the same type of things over and over and over again, you're never going to become better at your craft. Be willing to go out there and try something new. Try a different technique. Try different joinery. Build something that you never thought you could build before. I started my business building your typical farmhouse tables, and they were not great looking back at it. I made them out of construction lumber and tried to sand them smooth and stain them. And listen, I wasn't charging a whole lot for them either. So going from that, where I was 8 years ago, to where I am now, building the things that I build now, I mean, I've got epoxy tables, I do a lot of fireplaces, built-in pantries, I've upgraded the materials that I use, I've upgraded my tools, and I've upgraded my skills. And all that comes from trying something different. You're watching YouTube, so you have a desire to at least learn something. The best way to learn is to do it. And so you got to be willing to say, yes, I can build that. And it may not be great, and it may take you longer than you really wished it would have. But after you've done it, now you can say you've done it. Now you've learned the lessons, and the next time you do it, you're going to be a little bit better. So always be willing to go out of your comfort zone and try something new, because it will always lead to, at the very least, a lesson learned and the ability to do it better the next time. Try new things. All right, rule number 4. There's always a way to do it, and there's probably a tool for it. That's something that I've learned, and from one of the guys that I used to work for. One of the big things he told me was this job is 50% knowledge and 50% having the right tool. And that's very true. If you have the right tool, it makes your job a lot easier. So if you're trying to do something and you can't figure out how to do it, or you're doing it one way and it's just taking forever, do a little bit of research. There's probably a tool for it. And that is where this can be quite the expensive business. I've always told people that ask me, how much should I put into tools? I say, buy the tool for the job. That way, that tool is being paid for by the job that you're doing. For example, I have a CNC machine. I bought that because I had a job lined up that was going to pay for about a quarter of it, maybe a little bit more. And so I knew that was already a big chunk towards it. I knew ways that I was going to be able to pay it off through other jobs and just speeding up my process. Like I use that to cut out my cabinets now. My cabinets are cut out for me. I just got to put them on there, put in the program, and they're on the way to getting cut out. That helps speed up my process because while that's cutting, I can do other stuff. Know that somebody's run into this problem before, and they'll help you fix it because somebody came up with a tool for it. And the tools are crazy. So for example, this is a little edge trimmer for edge banding. Okay? It makes it a lot easier than running your knife along the edge. If you need to clean up edge banding, these little trimmer tools pinch on the side and will slide right through. Super easy. This is one of the most used tools in my shop, a nail gun. I do a lot of trim carpentry, so I'm using it all the time for baseboards, crown molding, all sorts of trims. I used to have the cheaper version of this, being the Ryobi, which I still have a few cheaper Ryobi tools. it's okay to start out with that. And some of those tools work just fine. Some of them don't work very well at all. I have had zero problems with the hammer drill from Ryobi. I think it's just fine. Haven't felt the need to upgrade. The palm router from Ryobi was terrible. I burnt through 2 of them and finally said, you know what? I'm going to spend the money, get the good one. I now have a DeWalt palm router and it's great. I'm sure Festool is even better, but I haven't felt the need to upgrade to that. So know that there's always a tool for the job, and you don't have to buy the super expensive tool right out of the gate. You can get to that later. Or sometimes you don't need to make that upgrade at all. So work your way to it, find a way. If you can't figure out how to get it done, go online. Somebody else has run into that problem before, and they can help you solve it. All right, the 5th rule, and my favorite rule of all, is to make a jig. Anytime you are doing something that you are repeating over and over again, I'd say for more than 3 or 4 times, make a jig. It's going to speed up your process. It's going to eliminate a lot of those little micro errors. You know, if you're pulling your tape measure 12 times to get a 24-inch piece, you're probably going to be a little bit off on at least a couple of those cuts. But if you set up a stop block at 24 inches from your miter saw blade, then it's just boom, slide it against, cut, slide it against, cut. A jig makes repeatable movements a lot easier. Now, jigs can come in 2 different forms. You have your pre-made jigs. One of my favorites of those is the pocket hole jig. I use this a lot with my cabinets. It basically helps hold pieces together while the glue dries, and also just adds a little bit more rigidity with those screws. And then the idea of the pocket hole is it's hidden, so you don't see it. I use it for my stretchers and my nailers in the back. Works great, okay? Now, you can use this for a whole lot of different stuff, but this is a pre-made jig, okay? Bought this from the store, comes with the drill bit, clamps. They've got a whole lot of upgrades, ones that are basically automatic now if you wanted those, but pre-made jigs work just fine. Then you have your more homemade jigs. I saw this jig on another YouTuber. This helps me flush pieces up, okay? So I take a little piece of 3/4 ply. I take the top off of my palm router, mount this to that, mount the scrap wood to the top, put the top back on, and now this bit that I've got in there, a surfacing bit, can just clean up anything that's sitting high. So this runs nice and smoothly along. Boom. A homemade jig now makes flattening pieces a lot easier. This is one of my favorite jigs. So those are my 2 favorite jigs. I use those all the time. They're fantastic. Another jig, this jig is just about a must-have if you are making cabinet doors. If you're going to put on the European hinges, which are concealed, you don't see those are probably on your cabinets right now. This jig right here, and there's a whole bunch of different brands that make it, but I happen to have Craig's, helps you space it off of the door and put that hole in perfectly. I use this every time I make cabinet doors. So those are a few of my favorite jigs. I like the concealed hinge jig, pocket hole jig, and my palm router little homemade jig to help me surface pieces. That's it for this video. Hope you learned something. If you did, please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. If I missed a rule, leave it in the comments down below. Maybe I'll next time. Thanks for watching Crafted in Florida.